working on, which really looks at different populations that the British government feeds from the 1830s workhouse through to the welfare state. So the book is going to end in 1971. So this is from what I think is going to end up being the second chapter about feeding prisoners. And in the chapter, I look also at kind of male prisoners and the idea of labor. I'm going to talk about labor today in relationship to women as well. I look at juveniles, and then I look at colonial prisons and the idea of raced bodies in prison. But this is drawn from that part of the book. And I'm happy in the question period to talk a little bit more broadly about the rest of the book. I think I'm going to stand to keep myself awake. I have terrible jet lag, so I hope you'll forgive me. So this is called A Fraction of a Man Dieting the Female Prisoner, 1843 to 1913. When the journalist and the amateur sociologist Henry Mayhew visited the criminal prisons of London in the early 1860s, he witnessed the growth of technologies associated with mass feeding. And that is the Pentonville kitchen. At Pentonville, Mayhew observed an intricate system used to track the number and location of prisoners that were being provided that day with each of the multiple dietaries in force. These so-called hieroglyphics, and that's what he called them, were chalked up on a slate in the serving room, interpretable only by the cook. The code of letters and numbers, erased daily and rewritten in a new formulation the next, tells a complicated story about the management of populations and individuals. Although uniformity could easily have been imposed through the issue of a single prison dietary, mandated across the nation, the British government consistently chose not to apply any rigid rationing schemes within the prison service. Instead, differences of sex, age, physical activity, and length of sentence were central considerations in the preparation of suitable dietaries, and exceptions were frequently made for those that fell outside the norms of classification. Prison authorities were thus animated by, and in the process reinforced, not a vision of the human body as a uniform machine, but rather a variety of bodily imaginaries predicated on human difference that had effects well beyond the walls of the prison. In 1921, Evelyn Ruggles Bryce, having just retired as head of the Prison Commission, reflected on the difficulties inherent in framing the prison dietary, given that it needed to be, quote, sufficient and not more than sufficient for the varying needs of the thousands of human beings of different ages and physique. And that's just a kind of smattering of the kinds of prisoners he would have been talking about. Like the other bodily regimes within the prison, particularly those of labor and punishment, the dietary was constantly revisited by local and central authorities throughout the 19th century, precisely because of a seemingly unresolvable tension between an administrative requirement for uniformity and simplicity and concerns that a just system needed to account for the readily apparent differences between prisoners. A workable scheme required limiting the number and types of meals provided, but a fair system acknowledged that different bodies had different food requirements. The compromise solution was to organize the prison population into a series of classes based on age, sex, length of sentence, and the labor performed. And here's just an example of what a daily dietary list would look like. And you can see that it's being separated into different kinds of groups there. Dietaries could thus be developed for each class, with leeway given to medical officials to meet the needs of exceptional cases. Thus, while the discourse of uniformity was consistently deployed throughout the 19th century and has been reinforced by historians, the practices of prison dieting were far more complex, as each prisoner had to be categorized according to these multiple variables and applications for alterations, some temporary, some permanent, adjudicated on a case-by-case basis. Now, when formulating prison dietaries, officials tended to treat the default prisoner as male. In an 1898 investigation into prison dietaries, this was made explicit. Quote, it being thought that their dietary was the crucial question, and that the diets of female prisoners would naturally follow the males. But even when not articulated, discussions of the feeding of prisoners from the 1840s onwards tended to assume that most prisoners were male, and their diet must therefore form the basis of institutional feeding practices. If prison dietaries were formulated with the needs of the male body in mind, prison officials could not ignore the presence of female inmates, especially once sex-segregated institutions were introduced, and were forced to consider how they should be rationed. And this is women at Tothill Fields Prison, and you see them with their toddlers and infants because small children were part of the prison service. And in a different part of this chapter, I deal with the feeding of infants and small children. I'm happy to talk about that after. So this opened up questions about the nutritional requirements of female versus male bodies, whether women's bodies could be, and in practice were being subjected to hard labor, and the relationship between food and women's psychological and emotional well-being. The answers to these questions were inconsistent across time and space, revealing while there existed a widespread belief in sex differences, no logic underpinned how to translate this into appropriate feeding practices. And throughout the course of this paper, I'm going to be throwing numbers at you. And the purpose of that is to confuse you. Okay? It's not so that this seems sensible and you're like, oh, I understand this mathematics. It's purposefully to make this as confusing as possible so that you understand what I'm arguing about this being completely illogical. Although the 1835 Prison Act sought to effect, quote, greater uniformity of practice in the government of prisons in England and Wales, it did not mandate a standard diet, only that the dietary scales of a prison be approved by the Secretary of State. And that should mean, I should say the Secretary of State for the Home Office, so the Home Secretary, essentially. It was not until the utilitarian reforming movement of the early 1840s that the Home Office made any concerted effort to regulate the dietaries of prisons. In 1843, Home Secretary Sir James Graham decided to introduce, quote, consistency and the utmost practical uniformity into the regulation of the prisons across England and Wales, particularly in relationship to diet and discipline. And this is the dietary that's going to come out of that process. The dietaries introduced in 1843 distinguished between male and female prisoners for those serving terms longer than 3 days. Women sentenced to between 4 and 13 days were to receive half the amount of bread allotted to men at the midday meal, the other meals remaining identical. For longer sentences, some of which included hard labor, women's bread ration was to be 1/4 less than that provided to men at every meal. For those sentenced to hard labor for terms exceeding 3 months, women received the same amount of bread and oatmeal gruel as men, but only 3/4 the meat and half the potatoes. Thus, even the Graham dietaries, which were predicated on uniformity, were internally inconsistent in regards to the rules that governed the relationship between the male and the female rations. Now, only a minority of prisons, 63 out of 140, adopted the Graham dietaries. Many that did not, nevertheless, operated on the same principle that women required less food than men. But a variety of different formulas were used to calculate the relationship between the male and female diet scales. At the Surrey House of Correction in Brixton in 1843, which was later to become a female convict prison, but at this point was mixed, women undergoing hard labor or solitary confinement received only 2/3 of men's bread allowance, although they received the same portion of oatmeal gruel, soup, and potatoes. Those not sentenced to hard labor or solitary confinement received the same portion of oatmeal gruel, beef, and soup, but 4/5 the bread. At Millbank in 1844, women received less bread and half the potatoes as men, but a more generous serving of cooked meat, 4/5 as opposed to 3/4 of the men's ration. And these variations continued into the 1850s and 60s. In 1857, Tothill Fields, which I showed you before, reformed its scale so that foodstuffs were identical in kind for both sexes, who were to receive the same portion of gruel, cocoa, meat, potatoes, and bread. The only differentiation was that men received 50% more soup than women, which accounted for about an extra 1.5 pints per week. At the same time, in the Hereford County Jail, women in all cases were given a reduced diet. 6 ounces less bread, 1 ounce less meat, 1/2 pound less potatoes per diem. At Lewes, the female diet was identical to the male, except that the women had 2 ounces of bread less at each meal. At Wakefield, the same was true, except the bread was merely 2 ounces less per day, rather than at each meal. At Newgate, women received 3/4 the men's bread allowance, but no other alterations were made. At the Ruthin County Jail, the female diet was identical to that of the males for the first 2 classes, and in the 3rd class, the only difference was that men had 1/3 more bread. The Middlesex House of Detention in Clerkenwell followed the opposite logic, reducing the female ration only for short sentence prisoners, so those are like prisoners of 3 or 4 days. It did not distinguish between male and female prisoners sentenced to 3 months and upward, but for lesser sentences, the female bread ration was 4/5 that of the male. The House of Correction at Preston was an outlier, allowing males considerably more food than females. Men received a weekly diet of solid and liquid food weighing 58 pounds 4 ounces, while women's weighed 34 pounds 1 ounce. Conversely, the 1857 dietaries for the Welsh jails did not distinguish between males and females at all. So these dietaries reveal great inconsistencies as to how female bodies were maintained in prison and exhibit no widely accepted or theorized relationship between males and females in relation to their need for nourishment. This lack of uniformity led various individuals and official committees investigating prisons in the early 1860s to call for reform. And the 1860s were a moment when there was a lot of talk about reform, not a lot of action necessarily. The 1863 Lord Select Committee on the Present State of Discipline in Jails and Houses of Correction, well aware of this plethora of practices, recommended that when diet scales were next altered, quote, the respective dietaries of male and female prisoners should be adjusted by a fixed rule and proportion. When a separate 1864 committee examined the dietaries in use in county and borough jails, its members established that it was not merely that prisons were not conforming to the 1843 recommendations, but that the Graham dietaries themselves were inconsistent in relationship to male and female diets. Quote, it is quite impossible to detect any distinct rule or principle which can have presided over the construction of the dietaries of the 2 sexes, the committee concluded. 2 separate reports emanating from this 1864 investigation, which had also investigated the convict dietaries, proposed that the principle of deducting 1/4 from the ordinary diet of male prisoners in all articles of food served in solid form should guide the framing of the female prison diet, leaving the liquids the same in both quantity and strength. And I left this out because it gets even more convoluted, but sometimes the soup was prepared in different ways for men and women. So, now this had been calculated based on the assumption that women weighed 1/6 less than men. This, the committee asserted, must be considered alongside the fact of, quote, the less active habits and employments of women, leading to a conclusion that 1/4 rather than 1/6 would be the appropriate deduction to account for both smaller frames and less energetic bodies. The fuzzy logic of these apparently scientific calculations was not lost on the physician Edward Smith, who had been investigating prison dietaries independent of any government commission since the early 1860s. And his stuff's really fascinating because he does a lot of stuff with prisoners' poo, essentially, which, I mean, makes for very interesting reading. He found the inquiries of 1863 and 1864 profoundly unscientific. He maintained that the notion that a woman weighed 1/6 less than a man and should therefore have 1/4 less food was based on little convincing evidence. They do not make any inquiries or give any proof upon which to base such a statement, he argued. And in their tables, he noted, they cut the female meat ration by 1/3, thus returning to an inconsistency that the committee had critiqued within the 1843 dietary. If neither the 1864 recommendations nor Smith's challenge to them in the end influenced the state's immediate policy on the female prison diet, the idea that women should be fed less food than men had traction well into the 20th century. In fact, even when the government introduced a dietary that, at least on the surface, appeared not to distinguish male from female bodies, the practice of reducing women's rations persisted. Now, the nationalization of the prison service in 1877 which brought the administration of local jails and convict prisons under the same centralized prison commission, occasioned a new dietary. And this is the dietary that comes out of that. It divided the prison population into two categories: those that performed hard labor and those that did not. Now, explicit in this classification was that all hard laborers were men. And this is something I'm going to return to a little later in the paper. One of the effects of this was, however, to downplay the difference between the female and male body, as females and non-laboring men were given an identical diet. There was no suggestion that because women were on average shorter or weighed less than men, that they required less food. Nor was there any assumption that because their habits were less active in general, this warranted a reduction in the diet. Now, this represented a radical break, both with the gendered ideology of the late Victorian period that saw the female body as inherently distinct from the male, as well as the traditional practice of dieting female prisoners on a reduced scale. But the simplicity and uniformity of the 1878 dietaries in the end could not trump either the gender norms of the period or long-standing institutional practices. And thus women continued, even after 1878, to be dieted differently than men. And this became apparent in the 1890s when the prison dietaries were revisited. So if you kind of stopped reading the government reports around this time, you would think, oh, so now all women are being fed. But this seems to be completely ignored in practice. Now, as part of the prison reforms of the 1890s, which was a moment when the kind of idea of a kinder and gentler prison service came into play, where punishments were being reduced. In this moment, again, it was another reforming moment, the idea of the prison diet was revisited. Now, in 1898, then, these investigations into the prison diet laid bare some of the practices that had been in place following these changes instituted in 1878. And testifying before the 1898 committee, Dr. A. Price, the medical officer for the prison at Liverpool, maintained that he'd made no statistical tables on women for the committee because the women's dietary was, quote, so variable as compared with men that for statistical purposes you could hardly draw out any statement with regard to them. Now, this suggested that not only were non-laboring male and female prisoners not being dieted the same as the 1878 scales had stipulated, but that the diets were so different from each other that they were not even comparable. That prison officials continued to believe that the diet of female prisoners should be scaled down from that provided to men was also made patent in these 1898 investigations. Few witnesses could authoritatively testify as to whether the female diet was or was not adequate. Almost all who were asked to do so claimed that they had not been asked to consider this question in advance, but were willing to venture an opinion that it was probably sufficient. That they could produce no statistics and had no knowledge of the female dietary strongly suggests that it was not the same as that provided for the male inmates of their prisons, whose diets they seemed to be intimately familiar with. Herbert Smalley, the prison service's medical inspector, confirmed that the information provided to the committee dealt only with male prisoners. Quote, it being thought that their dietary was the crucial question, and that the diets of female prisoners would naturally follow that for males, at a slightly lower rate, and with such slight modifications as has been found in the past to be suited to their constitutional requirements. This revealed both an enduring belief that women required less food, but also that the practices of giving women different food had persisted in harmony with what was clearly a widespread belief. Requiring little explanation that women's bodies had different physiological needs, his kind of expression of the constitution of women here, despite the fact that the official 1878 dietary had undermined these assumptions. The 1898 report produced by the Committee of Inquiry thus gave short shrift to the female dietary, but it did recommend that each class of prisoner in local prisons be distinguished by sex. In Class A, men and women were to receive the same amount of gruel, porridge, and potatoes, but women 3/4 of the bread and suet pudding. In their proposed new Class B diet, women were to be given the same diet as men, except less of it, with the exception of supper, where they were to be furnished with gruel while the men received porridge, the latter containing more oatmeal than the former. The reduction in the women's ration against the men's, however, continued to be applied inconsistently, and not solely on that 1/4 model. Whereas at breakfast and supper, bread was 3/4 of the men's allowance, that provided at dinner was identical to the adult male ration. Women were also to receive the same amount of potatoes at dinner, but while they received 3/4 of any cooked or preserved meat, their bacon ration was half that of the men's. The allowance of suet pudding and the beans in the bean and bacon meal were 4/5 of the male ration. In the Class C diet, the distinctions between the male and female diet were that women received 3/4 of the bread allocated to men at breakfast and supper, but the same at dinner. Here they received 2/3 of the potato ration at dinner. When the bean and bacon dinner was offered, they received the full amount of bacon, but only 5/6 of the beans. I just can't understand who even came up with this. Like, whose job was this? When meat was served, either cooked or preserved, women again received a reduced ration, but here it was again 4/5 of that allowed to adult men. Suet pudding, 5/6. None of this seemed to require any explanation, and thus none was provided, despite the fact that no fixed formula or principle governed these allowances, nor similar alterations made in the convict dietary. And despite the fact that this overturned the 1878 dietary that explicitly did not distinguish, at least on paper, between women and non-laboring men. So even on paper, this isn't a new switch, because on paper, there's no distinction between non-laboring men and women in 1878. Now there is a distinction on paper, but no one seems to need to rationalize that in any way. These dietaries thus perpetuated what James Crawford Dunlop, interim medical advisor to the Scottish Prison Commission, asserted was a generally accepted fact, that women required less food than a man, quote, both absolutely less and less relative to their body weight, the average woman having a smaller average weight and a smaller proportion of active tissue than a man. This was complicated, however, by a fact not always so readily apparent outside the walls of the prison, that female prisoners were often required to perform hard labor, whether they'd been sentenced to it or not. Before 1878, many prisons provided additional food to women who were employed in particularly strenuous activities, which in the context of prison was mainly laundry work. And women prisoners tended to do the laundry for their own prison and for other prisons as well. So male-only institutions, none of the men did the laundry in those prisons. It was farmed out to women at other prisons. In 1844, several female prisoners working in the laundry at Millbank requested more food. They received the support of the medical superintendent, who acknowledged the laborious nature of their occupation and recommended supplementing their diet with a pint of porter daily, except on Sundays. In 1848, the medical officer of the Surrey House of Correction allowed women employed in the wash house to receive more cocoa than the other female prisoners. And this became a very common practice in the 1850s and 60s. An 1852 report that had sanctioned a diet for female convicts that allowed those employed in the wash house and other equivalent hard labor to have an ounce of meat, a pint of broth added to their dietary 5 times a week, as well as 2 ounces of bread and 1.5 ounces of cheese daily. And this is actually quite a big extra bonus meal that they were getting. The dietaries returned by several prisons to the Home Office in 1857 made similar accommodations for women working in the laundries, allowing extra bread and cheese either daily or on work days. At Tothill Fields in 1866, women employed not only in the laundry, but in other, quote, laborious occupation were given extra rations, including more protein. Now, the generosity of the particular Tothill Fields laborious occupation was short-lived, because only a few years later that had been crossed out by hand in the dietary. So the wash house women got it, but nothing else could be considered laborious labor, so they had crossed that out. The 1864 report on convict dietaries recommended institutionalizing this widespread practice of allowing extra foodstuffs to women at hard work in the laundry. It proposed adding 3 ounces of bread and an ounce of cheese as an intermediate meal between breakfast and dinner, and increasing these women's meat ration to 4 ounces instead of 3. And this is a quote, partly in consideration of the extra exertion, and I'm going to come back to the partly point later. The Home Secretary reasserted this policy in 1896. that the nature and portions of the extra diet he mandated were identical to that prescribed in 1864, strongly suggests that this 1896 directive was merely mandating a very long-standing practice in the convict prisons, where hard labor remained part of the sentence for female convicts. In local prisons, the nature of women's labor and its relationship to the diet was even more complex. The 1878 committee charged with constructing a national dietary concluded that it was labor rather than sex that should be the determining factor in setting the scales. Men with hard labor were to receive the most rations, while non-laboring men, women, and juveniles would all be rationed according to a separate scale. So there were, again, only two categories. Men with hard labor, and then women, juveniles, and non-laboring men are in the second category. So they're all fed the same. The 1878 report argued that the demands made upon the physical energies of female prisoners was practically the same whether they were sentenced to hard labor or not. This was because their employments within the prison system did not, quote, admit of that sharply drawn distinction between hard labor and light labor, which is possible amongst the males. And this is, I think, their image of women doing labor in prison. These women are gardening. That's obviously kind of light labor, right? There's not amongst female prisoners, they maintain, the same inequality as to expenditure of energy. The 1878 dietary for local prisons thus denied the fact that women engaged in strenuous labor of any sort, implying that it was not even possible for them to truly undertake hard labor. Thus, because no woman apparently expended more energy than any other woman within the local prison service, no additional food needed to be stipulated for women working either in laundries or anywhere else within the prison. Now, this type of female labor persisted within the prison system, however, and some local authority chose to acknowledge and compensate female prisoners for it by continuing to allow those extra foodstuffs, as was the practice in convict prisons. And here's another image of women doing laundry. This became evident when a variety of officials testified before that 1898 Committee on Prison Dietaries. Few of the 1898 witnesses raised the issue of the diet for women engaged in hard labor, but those that did suggested that this was a fairly long-standing practice, even in local prisons, despite the refusal of the 1878 rules to acknowledge the fact of women's labor. The medical officer for Maidstone noted that he allowed female prisoners engaged in hard labor a better diet, but did not elaborate, insinuating that he was merely continuing a practice that predated his appointment. The governor of Knutsford was more forthcoming. He opined that the women set to washing should have tea. It is hard work, and they don't get through it satisfactorily. They don't lose weight, but they don't do it with comfort to themselves without having some sort of extra food. Undoubtedly, women doing the harder class of work, he insisted, should have some extra diet. But the issue of extra food for women engaged in hard labor did not enter into the 1898 report at all. In part, this was because the question seemed to have become moot, at least in the context of local prisons. Just as the 1878 rules did away with the distinction between laboring and non-laboring women, but preserved the category of the hard laboring male prisoner, the 1898 committee had decided to do away entirely with all diets for local prisons that distinguished between those on hard labor and those not, regardless of sex. But in doing so, the committee failed to acknowledge that while prisons might be scaling back on forms of hard labor that were merely forms of punishment, such as, this is a very famous picture of the treadmill and the crank, which were often not being used to power anything at all, someone still had to do the laundry within the prison system that fell largely to females. And this is, I love this picture. It's women exercising, again, with their babies. And I was looking at this image for the purpose of making the case that there's still babies in the prison, quite late 19th century. But you can see women carrying a huge, heavy thing of laundry in there. And just by chance, yesterday, when I was at the National Archives, I was looking at some photos, beautiful, incredible photos, prison photos, and came across ones of women doing laundry. So there's a lot of photographic evidence, and I'm so glad for these photos because the textual evidence is not really there. But in the photographs, you really see the continuance of women doing what we all know to be hard labor, right? This is not a washing machine era. So when it came to approving the new dietaries based on the 1898 recommendations, the fact of women's hard labor was thus erased. The dietary approved by the Secretary of State in 1901 for local prisons was silent on the issue of an extra diet for female laundry workers. When in its draft form in 1898, the rules for the female convict dietary had extended the 1896 policy that those employed in washing or other exceptionally hard work were to be granted an extra allowance. But when the new convict dietaries were finally approved in 1901, there was no mention of this extra allowance. Only in the rules for Scotland, approved in 1900, was the practice of providing women at work in the laundry, the baths, or the reception rooms an extra allowance officially sanctioned. In the end, though, this was no more than a quarter of a pint of tea between breakfast and dinner, and again in the afternoon, a comfort and a privilege rather than a nutritional supplement. This meant that in practice, extra food could continue to be prescribed by the medical officer, but no local or convict prison was obliged by law to provide it, thus diverting attention away from the female body's physical requirements. Those that supported providing additional foodstuffs for laboring female prisoners tended to justify this by emphasizing women's psychological rather than their physical needs. This was part of a discourse that it was not so much productive female bodies that demanded extra nourishment from the state, but female emotions that needed to be controlled through perquisites in the form of food, such as the tea provided in Scotland. Now, as historians have repeatedly demonstrated, Victorian prison officials often psychiatrized female prisoners, who they understood to be, quote, temperamentally unstable and more, quote, intractable, violent, and difficult than male prisoners, which in turn led to specialized interventions. I should actually be delivering this in a straitjacket. The 1864 committee had downplayed the physical requirements of the female laboring body for extra food, focusing instead on the depressing conditions within the prison itself and the widespread understanding that an improved dietary had beneficial effects on the mental stability of prisoners undergoing long sentences. And here's Elizabeth Fry, the prison reformer, and what is clearly a very depressed woman. When they argued for an increased diet for women engaged in laundry work, their recommendation was made chiefly, and if you remember earlier, their first recommendation was that these women get extra food partly because of the exertion. But here's the second part of that phrase: chiefly in consideration that female prisoners are obliged to undergo the whole of their sentence within the prison walls, the majority of them being under sentence for 4 years and upwards, which they felt would take a toll on the prisoner's mental health. Here's women working inside the prison. Men got to go outside and do hard labor, breaking stones, that kind of thing, in the bracing fresh air. Women were sort of multiply confined within the prison. The 1878 committee felt justified in doing away with any differences of diet for female local prisoners, founded upon distinctions as to labor, not only because they charged that these differentiations were for the most part hypothetical, but because they were apt to be considered a source of injustice and to give rise to bickering and jealousy. Now, this was not entirely a problem of female prisoners. The 1864 report on convict dietaries had also recommended that men on the hard labor diet should be kept separate from men on the light labor diet, as jealousy, same word, tended to arise out of men who are associated together having different dietaries. But unlike the debate surrounding the diet of male prisoners, this focus on the need to manage the emotionally volatile bodies of female inmates was widespread. While female prisoners on different dietaries could just as easily be kept separate from each other, making all women's diets identical, the 1878 report implied, would make the female prison population more docile and easier to manage. The few who ventured an opinion on increasing the diet for women at laundry work during the 1898 inquiry reinforced the notion that the extra food being provided served more of a psychological than a physiological purpose. The Reverend A.W. Baldwin, the chaplain at Ormond Scrubs, a local prison where women were not supposed to be undergoing sentences of hard labor, downplayed the physical need for an additional diet. Now, although his expertise as a reverend was clearly the spirit rather than the body, This did not stop him from confidently asserting that women could work on less food than men. If women working in the laundry were to receive more food, and butter and tea and extra kinds of things, which were not part of the ordinary diet, he argued, this should only be after 8 or 9 months and should be understood as a privilege. So using this language of privilege and allowing additional diet only after a very lengthy period suggested that rather than fulfilling the needs of the female laboring body for additional nourishment, the food was a reward for a particular kind of prison behavior. Dr. G.C. Walker, the governor and medical officer for the all-female convict prison at Aylesbury, provided the extra bread and cheese for women in the laundry and maintained that he would continue to do so, but not because he considered it necessary to keep up with the physical demands of this type of work placed on the body. Instead, he furnished the extra allowance because it would cause, quote, a great disturbance for it to be discontinued, and because it was a great incentive to go into the laundry. This again structured this food as a perquisite, an incentive to labor, and a way to maintain control over volatile women, rather than a dietary supplement necessary for energy replacement. Other alterations were made to the female dietary in the 1890s for similar reasons. The only recommendation put forward by the 1894 Departmental Committee on Prisons in regards to the prison diet scales was to discontinue the stirabout for female inmates. This was a porridge made from equal parts oatmeal and Indian meal that female prisoners, particularly those in London, disliked and routinely returned uneaten. At some prisons, such as Holloway, which we all know is where most of the suffragettes were, women routinely knocked their window glass out when served stirabout, which even the medical officer admitted was very unpalatable, compelling the kitchen to substitute oatmeal porridge to keep order. Now, this is me cheating because that is a suffragette in prison with a broken window, but I don't know that she's broken it because of the stirabout. Now, many of the witnesses thus proposed that stirabout be totally eliminated from the female dietary across the nation, which was approved in 1895 clearly as a means to curb unruly female behavior. The 1898 committee similarly proposed providing tea to long-sentenced women in local prisons as a similar concession to their need for familiar and comforting food, lest their emotional lives become unbearable. The provision of tea, the committee concluded, would tend to make the lives of the women in prison more contented, again focusing on their emotional and mental well-being rather than on their body's physical needs. The dietary that was eventually issued in 1901 included a few other extras for female convicts only. These included 2 ounces of golden syrup to be served with their suet pudding, and for the pudding to be made out of white rather than wholemeal flour. A more controversial addition was the substitution of white bread for wholemeal bread. That looks good to me. But wholemeal bread had long been, although it was understood to be kind of more nutritious than white bread, and was not only cheaper to produce, but could be furnished in a prison or a workhouse because of these issues of health, it was not well liked, particularly not by the women. They could argue that wholemeal bread had been introduced, not on, quote, penal grounds, but entirely in the interest of the prisoner. And thus many people argued that there was no scientific basis for making this change to white bread for women. The only basis for this recommendation was the fact that wholemeal bread, like the stirabout that had already been eliminated, was distasteful to female convicts. And this was because, quote, it was apparently scarcely known to the lower classes, which tells us, as we probably all know, that white bread was really cheap in the 19th century and it was very widely eaten. In 1898, the medical officer at the Liverpool prison argued that the women in his jail objected to the wholemeal bread very strongly. Now, many believed that there was no reason for this indulgence and that were white bread to be given, it should also be given to male prisoners. It was introduced into the dietary for female convicts only. Now, this was presumably, and this is just me kind of trying to figure this out, this was presumably because while men may have grumbled, they seemed more readily to eat the wholemeal bread, while women returned it much more often, making it harder to feed them adequately given the centrality of bread to the prison diet. And here you can see a men's prison with little buckets of food being distributed with a big chunk of bread on top. It was a huge part of the prison diet. But the strong objections women had raised to the stirabout and the difficulty of keeping order amongst female prisoners that had resulted from repeated servings of this loathed food were likely not far from the minds of those who decided to allow women, but women only, white bread at the discretion of the prison authorities. Okay, so now we're going to get to the suffragettes. The female dietary did not become an issue again until the second decade of the 20th century, as suffragettes began to pose difficulties for the prison service. Now, much has been written about suffragettes' use of the hunger strike and the government's deployment of forcible feeding in response. And this is in part why I'm not going to talk about force feeding particularly in my book, but I direct you all to Kevin Grant in particular, who's done really good work on this. But these tactics were only one way in which food became a political tool in the battle between feminists and the state. In 1910, Winston Churchill, himself a target of suffragette violence, introduced Rule 243A to deal with the significant numbers of middle and upper-class women in particular entering prison for suffragette activities, who then deployed the hunger strike to protest the state's refusal to grant them political prisoner status. Rule 243A allowed special privileges to be bestowed upon second and third division prisoners, quote, of good previous character, who have not been committed for offenses involving dishonesty, cruelty, indecency, or serious violence, in order to skirt the issue of admitting these women to the first division, which since 1865 had been reserved for political prisoners. So this is the battle that's being fought in the jails, is for the suffragettes demanding to be treated as political prisoners, not hooligans, and thus admitted to the first division. So what this rule is doing essentially is saying we're not going to admit you, but we're going to give you some of the same special privileges, one of those being food. So one of these privileges was that of receiving outside food, so food not from inside the prison. The rule was conceived before Herbert Gladstone, Churchill's predecessor as Home Secretary, left office, and was intended, he argued, to divest imprisonment of the features, quote, which strike people as degrading and harmful to the class of prisoners we have to consider, and remove conditions which are particularly galling to some nervous temperaments and trying to weak physiques without allowing political hooligans to achieve first division status. And of course, the kind of imagery we know from the suffragette campaign seeks to portray them as hooligans. Gladstone thus suggested the prison service should acquiesce in the provision of special foods to these women, precisely because their twin disorders, emotional volatility and feeble bodies, and that's contained in this idea of nervous temperaments and weak physiques, made them difficult to manage within the context of the prison regime, however humane it had become in the wake of the reforms brought about by his own 1894 committee. Ruggles-Bryce was, however, opposed to allowing suffragettes access to outside food, regardless of what other privileges were granted to them. This was the most valuable of all the First Division privileges, he argued, and thus to concede it was for all intents and purposes to grant them First Division status. Given that the prison diet was greatly improved in recent years, he claimed, no public end could be served by, quote, allowing a fastidious prisoner to spurn the food provided and to assume an invidious superiority by ordering luxuries from the neighboring tavern. Churchill was, however, adamant that prisoners of a certain class should be permitted to purchase food from outside. This was a means, he stated, to prevent a renewal of suffragettes' hunger strikes and the concomitant advantages of martyrdom. I am anxious to deprive them of the slightest excuse for contumacy or of any ground on which the public sympathy could be excited, Churchill explained. Wish I could do a good Churchill. By providing them with the indulgence of eating their own food and thereby according them the fullest measure of creature comforts compatible with imprisonment, he reasoned, will not only avoid unpleasant developments, but wield a powerful weapon of ridicule against various forms of suffragette lawlessness. And his adamant about wanting to do this. He's getting tons of resistance from the prison commissioner, Ruggles Bryce, but he is adamant that he's going to give them this nice food. Although in the end, Rule 243A did not spell out the dietary privileges afforded to suffragettes, an accompanying memorandum made clear that these prisoners should be dieted as First Division prisoners, who were allowed to purchase their own food at their own expense. At the same time, those who refused either the prison diet or the food they had procured for themselves were to be subjected to forcible feeding with no delay. So if forcible feeding was the stick, privileged access to superior food was thus the carrot. Both were part of the state's arsenal of weapons used to shame, humiliate, and assert the state's ultimate authority over the lawless female body. And here, the forcible feeding is comic, but as we know, forcible feeding is a violent attack on the body that left these women permanently damaged and very, very ill. But Rule 243A was also clearly a source of discomfort for the Prison Commission, and like most other policies introduced to deal with suffragettes, it was soon altered. Once Churchill had left his post as Home Secretary in October 1911, Ruggles Bryce reopened the issue. In 1912, he urged the Undersecretary of State for the Home Office to modify Rule 243A, which he claimed had caused embarrassment to the prison administration in having to admit for suffragette prisoners numberless articles of diet, many of them fanciful, none of them essential to health. Instead, he argued the medical officer should be given discretion as to the class of dietary given to these prisoners, having regard to their age, condition, and state of health. The privilege of obtaining outside food, he argues, was widely felt by the prison commissioners to be an unreasonable one to concede to lawbreakers, whatever class they belong or whatever opinions they may profess. So in March 1913, this alteration was made, leaving it to the medical officer to prescribe the appropriate diet for suffragettes. The new orders also permitted these prisoners a parcel of food of 11 pounds or less to be sent in by friends once a week, to be consumed in addition to or instead of the prison dietary, unless the medical officer objected to any of the contents. This policy was introduced a month before the passage of the Cat and Mouse Act, which temporarily released suffragettes undergoing hunger strike from prison should their health be endangered. Both policy shifts suggested the ways that food continued to be a problematic but central concern of the management of female prisoners. If suffragettes laid bare the very physicality of their bodies through the practices of the hunger strike, the government continually reframed this behavior as another aspect of the hysteria that characterized all their activities. While the government's rejoinder to suffragette hunger strikes was forcible feeding, it also attempted to deploy food as a perquisite to pacify women seen to have nervous temperaments and unruly dispositions. Although the government refused to grant them First Division status, providing privileged access to food was itself a political maneuver aimed at curtailing unreasonable objections to the prison regime by allowing these women to partake of what Ruggles Bryce had noted were fanciful and thus emotionally pleasing rather than nourishing provisions. The government's techniques of feeding suffragette prisoners, both forcibly and through granting access to special foods, were thus connected to much longer-standing state practices that used the prison dietary to draw attention to women's psychological and emotional difference rather than their material needs. Even well into the 20th century then, as nutrition was increasingly being subjected to scientific studies, questions of sexual and gender difference continued to shape understandings of how much and what kind of food bodies required. Although scholarship on the 19th and early 20th century prison regime has tended to foreground the drive towards uniformity of practice, a close reading of prison dietary suggests the ways in which the prison participated in the production and reinforcement of bodily imaginaries that distinguished British subjects from each other. While all might be equal before the law, after the law had passed its judgment, the bodies of criminals were to play an active role in performing and inhabiting the categories of difference that structured British society. The prison diets issued in the 19th and early 20th centuries continued to be based on sex, despite the fact that no empirical evidence was produced or even sought to support the widely held idea that women's physiological needs were different than men's. The prison dietary thus reinforced sex as one of the fundamental organizing principles of British society, a fact that made uniformity in the rationing of prisoners not only difficult to achieve, but in the end, of little use to the state. Thank you.